Adam, welcome to the show, my friend.
Thank you, Aubrey. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, for sure. It's always really cool when you know somebody by watching them, and I've watched you on MythBusters primarily. It's one of the first kind of the most exposure I've had to you, and then all of a sudden, here you are at my table sitting across from me, and we're just going to talk about stuff and figure it out. That's always a rad experience for me. So.
Well, I love coming to Austin. Any excuse to come here. I've spent a lot of time here, often for South by, but also my friend Tom Sachs had a big retrospective show at the Museum of Contemporary Art here.
Cool.
Came down a couple years ago.
A retrospective show for the contemporary art. That seems like a
He's
paradox.
a contemporary artist.
Yeah, beautiful, man. So, and you got a new book coming out.
I do. Every Tool's a Hammer. It came out about a week and a half ago.
And I've actually I think I've practiced that before, like in the absence of a hammer, needing to hammer something in.
It's
like,
whatever.
What have I not used?
It is the title is a joke told by an old colleague of mine, the late Mark Buck. I worked with him at Industrial Light and Magic on the Star Wars prequels. He also worked with Tori Beleche and Grant Imahara when we were all there. And Mark used to say that. Remember, in every tool, there is a hammer.
Yeah.
And he's making a joke about the improvisational nature of making, about how we'll grab anything and use that tool for whatever we need it for.
Yep.
But I think he's also, like the way I always took it and what I love about it is that it's about the hidden life inside the things around us. And as makers, I'm specifically always finding other uses for tools than what they were originally intended. In fact, that's perhaps an alternate title for MythBusters: misusing tools for reasons they were never intended.
Right.
And again, it's an improvisational nature, but it's also about looking at things with a wider lens.
Yeah, I mean, I can think back to all of the successful and failed attempts, like rocks. I've certainly provided that. I've actually broken hammers, these surrogate hammers on the nails as well. Like, well, that was a bad idea.
I've used my phone.
Yeah, totally.
Yep.
Like all kinds of different interesting things. But that's I think the problem solving nature that's at the very core basis of why humans became the dominant species on this earth, right? Is like we were figuring out stuff like, okay, here's a problem. There's a monster and it has really long teeth and sharp claws and it's so much faster and so much bigger than me. What am I going to do? Well, I'll make a long pointy thing. That's my first strategy.
And I totally agree. I completely agree. And I think that the other half of that equation from the tool building, which is aside from some work that corvids do, crows and ravens and some chimpanzees are potentially in the Stone Age currently in their use of tools. But right now it's only humans that really utilize tools and modify them. But the other half of that equation is that we tell stories about those tools. We exchange the information about what we did. Oh, if we hide behind this thing, then when the mammoths come by, we can kill more of them with these sticks if we're all gathered together.
So communication becomes a tool that's also a differentiator.
And to me, communication, the origin of communication is the story. The story isn't ancillary. It is the driver. It is the facts that are in context because of a need.
Yeah.
And I make this distinction because, I went to high school like everyone else, and I couldn't stand math because it felt just like this monolith of facts I had to memorize. And I have since come to love mathematics as a field because it is a magnificent and beautiful, ever variegated field. And I watch YouTube videos about complex math concepts and I get maybe 20% of them. But the rich story within what numbers can do and all the different ways you can surmise pi, that's what my math teachers should have been explaining.
Yeah.
But when you're teaching to a test of like, well, do they know their multiplication tables? The multiplication tables don't matter.
Right. They're easily replicable.
Yeah.
I think that the interesting part, because I had an uncle who was he was a mathematics professor at Rice, and he was at the bleeding edge where he's creating new math.
Right.
And that was fascinating. Right. That was really incredible for me. You're creating new math.
Right.
Whoa, that's amazing. Because otherwise I could just ask somebody who's better at math and they could give me the exact right answer, which was my hesitancy towards that field. I was like, well, I like words and writing because I can talk about that cactus a million ways and my way is going to be unique.
So let me tell you a story. A friend of mine is a film editor, and he says, I'm great at math. I'm just not that good with numbers. So when you're writing, you're applying really complex algorithms about how you want that writing to go. Those algorithms are part of your system. They're in your brain. You might not be able to quantify them. And we as human beings might never be able to quantify what makes a truly amazing edit on writing or on film. And yet there is an algorithm being applied. And that's math.
Damn, you just blew my mind with that, because you're kind of right. It's just applying, the numbers are more varied because the words have nuances for the same thing. Like a number is kind of like a concrete symbol for the most part.
We think of it as a concrete symbol. Yes. And again, I think that's educational. I one of the things, if I right now, if the drum I love beating is that art and science are not two sides of a spectrum. And we always use them that way. Oh, well, it's both an art and a science. And what we mean is, oh, it's got some loosey-goosey stuff and it's got some really rigorous stuff.
Yeah.
But there's plenty of art that is some of the most rigorous things you've ever seen. And there's plenty of science that is about as loosey-goosey as it could possibly get. And both, again, are simply ways that we tell stories to each other in order to understand ourselves.
All right, so let me posit this question then.
Yeah.
I mean, understanding that, do you think that AI will ever be able to write a brilliant sonnet or paint a brilliant picture that will be moving to the human emotional, like the human perception of art?
Well, there's two parts to that question, right? The first is, will a computer be able to write a beautiful sonnet? And then I think the soul of the question, as I find really interesting, is that would be beautiful to a human. Because I could easily imagine an AI writing a poem that would be magnificent to another AI. And they'd be like, ooh, but we wouldn't understand one thing about it.
Right.
Right. They're like, oh, we decided to go with the octodecimal system because we thought that was like more, I don't know, maybe they're playing with complex plane geometry in their heads. But I don't feel like I don't feel anytime soon that we're going to get to AI that is writing beautiful poetry. I certainly think that AI could write plenty of crappy poetry that would pass as crappy human poetry.
Right.
But the idea that an AI would become sophisticated enough to start to have these, whatever meta view we have of the world as we're moving through it, I don't. To me, it's like worrying about thermonuclear war just after the discovery of fire.
Yeah, it's almost like
definitely online.
It's like the emotional body algorithm is so inherently rich and so inherently nuanced and so inherently unquantifiable that to assume that the AI could have the data set necessary for the human emotional perceptual body to be able to replicate something that would be effective for that, I think it's possible, but it's just seems unlikely to me.
I'm already out over my skis on this, but I'm about to step way out over my skis and say I think this also posits, the way we talk about it culturally posits that the brain works within a Newtonian frame. It works within the classical laws of physics, and I don't think we have enough evidence to state that. It turns out that certain aspects of I was just hearing someone tell me about this the other night, that certain aspects of the way lithium, the drug, affects our mood and helps psychotic patients with their illness. I'm sorry if I'm using an antiquated term, happens at the quantum level. And so does our sense of smell. Now, this is just what an incredibly smart person I was dining with was explaining to me. But that all of a sudden takes us into a whole other realm where replication becomes a completely other beast. So again, I don't sit in fear of AI. I definitely don't think we should be giving guns to robots. I think that's the crappiest idea I've ever heard.
That's the leap that everybody makes, though, right?
Right.
Like everybody's like, well, watch out for AI because then AI will be making other militarized AI, and then they're going to be in charge of that. Like, let's not do that.
It's not AI we have to fear. We're already letting red light cameras and speed cameras write us tickets, and they're violating our constitutional right to face our accuser, which is to see the algorithm because they consider it a proprietary. If I can't see the reason, if it's set at the wrong speed and I can't see that, then there's no legal process. I've been mad about red light cameras since their inception 25 years ago with exactly this argument. This is a terrible slope to go down to trust machines. The people who program them are idiots. Well, okay. The people who program the machines are not idiots, but the distribution of idiots is equivalent across humanity.
Sure. And when there's a failure, there's no recourse, right? Like there's none of that.
Punish the algorithm, make it sit inside for 2 weeks.
It doesned care.
No,
that's the thing. It has none of the motivational aspects.
There was a TED Talk a couple of years ago called "Weapons of Math Destruction," and Kathy O'Neill, I believe, is the speaker, and she talked about how an algorithm is simply an opinion rendered in math. And until we understand that culturally, and as long as we don't understand that culturally, we're actually causing danger to each other. I don't know how we got this far afield.
I don't know, but I don't know either. But that's the way it goes. This is the way the podcast rolls. One thing, I did notice in one part of your bio that you were on an episode talking about whether humans might live forever, which kind of interfaces with machine and kind of the technology interfacing with humans. What was the conclusion of that kind of investigation that you had?
That was a special I did for the Discovery Channel, part of their Curiosity series that was started by John Hendricks, who's the genius who started the Discovery Channel. John Hendricks is one of the few people I've ever met. Well, you think, wow, one guy started the Discovery Channel. And you're like, what is that guy like? And then you meet John Hendricks and you're like, oh, that's what he's like. He's like crazy smart, super present, super charismatic. I've watched him stand up and give extemporaneous speeches, and it blew my mind. So when he asked me to be on a series for his thing, I was like, yes.
Okay, this is really good. I'm going to pause you here because I'm glad that you know the guy who started the Discovery Channel, because I have a gripe.
I'm not sure I have any pull.
All right? So what happened to me one day is I was turned on the Discovery Channel and I saw a documentary on mermaids.
Oh,
I saw a documentary on mermaids.
Yeah.
And I left and I finished that documentary and I was like, wow, the aquatic ape theory is real. Right. There were mermaids.
Yeah.
And then I go look up and there was just a fictionalized, imaginatory thing on the Discovery Channel. I was like, oh my God, I got duped. There's no mermaids.
Yes. That was Discovery succumbing to something that I didn't appreciate.
I was like, well, what is it? And then they tried to do it again with megalodons. And I was like, no. You got me once. You got me once with mermaids, but this megalodon thing, no. I say no.
Yeah. When the then head of Discovery, when that Megalodon documentary was coming out, I wrote to the person who was then the head of Discovery Channel, and I said, I don't think this is a good idea. I don't
Leave it at mermaids.
You have an amazing, I think we have an amazing brand in Shark Week, one that I've been loved and proud to have been a part of on many occasions. We only get a couple chances before we break this brand, and don't do this with this. And they disagreed, and that is their prerogative. But that sort of programming drives me crazy. Hopefully those days are over.
I haven't seen any new ones after mermaids and megalodons.
I believe it was a passing phase, like an adolescence.
No
and they
doubt.
like to believe in weird crap. Can You Live Forever was an hour-long show in which I lived for 1,000 years, and we took every current medical technology about life extension, from limb replacement to brain enhancement to skin refreshing. All of this was cast as optimistically forward as possible. And I like the exercise. What medicine can do mechanically to us is its best feature. Yeah. Replacing our limbs or fixing parts of our bones. It is the thing I think the doctors are the absolute best at. And it's an exciting time to be alive. I had a family member who grew up with one leg longer than the other and went through some difficult surgeries, but was a cheerleader and a gymnast and will live a totally normal life because of what medicine can do, and that's really exciting. But the class implications of life extension are horrifying. Right. I mean, that's the first thing that I say. The second thing is something that I realized at some point, like on some late night, like mental binge of what if. I thought, you know what? I don't know. Our consciousness is totally. Our consciousness is the miracle that I experience every day. Yeah. Right. My sentience, my ability as a colony of bacteria and cells that somehow can understand itself and make its decisions is astounding. And when I think about that, I think, well, could the thing that creates my consciousness be immortal? Sure. I don't even know where it comes from, so I don't know any of its properties. So that could be possible. But as I thought about immortality, I thought, oh my God, I'll bet immortality is crushingly boring.
That is something that I think we're underestimating. I think we're underestimating one. I mean, I think I have my own experiential spirituality that would lead me to believe, and of course, this is something that I'm just positing based on my own experience, that consciousness is unborn and undying. However, don't expect anybody to take my word for this. This is N=1, my own personal experience.
Exactly.
However, looking at that, I also recognize that, human beings' nature to kind of procrastinate and devalue these things that are in radical abundance and just kind of normalize it. Like, there was a famous line from the movie Troy where Achilles was mentioning to his lover, I forget her name, she says, "The gods envy us because we're mortal." Like there's something precious about the fact that we are going to die.
Also, does one think, if you're out there and you're listening to this and you're thinking, oh no, immortality would be great, I'd learn all this amazing stuff about humanity and its arcs. Okay, so if that's the case and you think that would be really interesting from a historical perspective, let's think about who gets to see humanity in its rawest form, because that's eventually what you'd be doing. You'd be seeing all of our venality played out on this grand scale. So go talk to a cop and ask a cop what they think of humanity. Yeah. I couldn't do that job. There are good cops and there are bad cops, and I've worked with hundreds or even thousands of them over the years. And one of the things that really gets me is the view they get of humanity is really upsetting. Yeah. And they don't. And I've talked to several. It's like, yeah, after a few years of this, I'm just kind of disappointed in people. Yeah. And after a few hundred years, I completely imagine that would be the default state. So I like to I'm not interested in life extension.
Just a bunch of jaded, elitist,
right.
bored
Exactly.
immortals. Wow, congratulations, we really screwed this up for ourselves.
So in that same youthful mental bender I went on, I concluded that if our consciousness is immortal, then we come here to experience all of the joy and the terror of beginnings and endings.
Also, the natural tendency for momentum. We're discovering and learning so much more about trauma and the impact that trauma has over a lifetime, right? Yeah. Like so many things that happen in our childhoods are playing out through the entirety of our life. To imagine the idea of no reset button ever, on that thing, like the accumulation of these things that, I suppose if we got better at our trauma processing, which is what maps.org and a lot of different organizations are working on, and then I think it becomes a little bit more interesting. But at this point, where we have momentum that's kind of taking us down these pathways that can actually be, almost impossible to reverse these initial traumas, accumulating trauma over 1,000 years. Wow, we might be really fucked up.
Well, so I read this thing. My wife is a marriage and family therapist and has done a lot of research into trauma. It's one of the areas she's working in, and obviously it's a large part of her training. And one of the definitions she came home with to talk about was that trauma is the peeling back of the curtain that these kind of things could happen at any second. And we live in this delightful fiction. Most of us, most of the time, are allowed to live a delightful fiction that life has a consistency, that there are reasons for everything, and that we have some measure of control. And all of those are complete fantasies.
They are.
And
until they get shattered.
Until they get shattered. And then when you experience them getting shattered, you have to literally piece yourself back together, back to a fiction that can accommodate both of these things. And that was one of the theories about what trauma really is for us. It's that piecing back together of the self, which is itself an illusion.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's just so many reactionary mechanisms that take place. Like you experience something traumatic, you realize the fragility of life itself. And then so your reaction is, well, if I'm super attached to how good life is and life is that good and it can be taken away like that, well, that's super terrifying and painful. So let me dampen the goodness and enjoyment of life so that if it goes away, well, at least I'm not losing that much. So all these psychological processes that are preparing us for our inherent fragility.
My therapist, my wife's a therapist, my mom's a therapist. I've been in therapy for most of my life. I'm a huge believer in talking about your shit.
Yeah.
And my therapist has this great thing that he's regularly saying, which is, no. I know that feels like a dumb coping mechanism now, but the moment you came up with it, when you were like 15 or 22, when you came up with it, it was a survival mechanism. And it was really clever of your brain to figure out this way for you to get through that week, day, month, year. It's just that they're not useful afterwards.
Right.
And it's nice to give credit to the system for protecting you in some way.
Yep.
Oh, this must be my fault. That's what a lot of kids end up doing. Trauma in my life, it must be my fault because I cannot conceive as a child that things could go so far out of control. Right. And I mean, one of our duties as parents, I don't know if you have kids, I have two boys. I considered one of my key duties as a parent when raising them was to raise them for a while with the fiction of consistency, so that they can so that they have some framework with which to deal with the fact that there is none. Like we need this. I think we humans need this fortitude, and we need each other to get through these kind of things.
I think giving credit to what the function of the thing was, I think that's something that even like Dr. Gabor Mate, as he talks about addiction, like addiction is an attempt to solve a problem.
Yes.
Right. Instead of it saying like, oh, it's a disease and it's bad and like pushing it away and not
both.
looking at it.
It can be both.
It's both.
Yeah.
Right. So like looking at it like, no, the addict is just attempting to solve a problem. And his way to solve the problem is through ameliorance and escapism.
Yeah.
And that's created a dependency and a pattern that now we have to release that dependency in the pattern. But when you understand that it actually has a logical root to a certain degree, and then you can give appreciation
for watching
to
television or movies or reading books or all the ways in which we fill our brains and distract ourselves. And I mean, I don't mean that all of those things are simply modes of distraction, because many of them we also use to become more connected to the things around us.
Sure.
But yeah, I think you're totally right. Paying respect for that, those ways in which your body protects yourself, your body and your mind.
Yeah, I think we sometimes just assume that everything that's happened is just, oh, something was broken. He's broken. He's an addict. Oh, it's genetic and blah, 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 broken. But like when we really look and give credit to the logical underpinnings of all this, again, it goes back to math. Like what was the mathematical equation that caused this result and adaptation?
My brain went through to come to that conclusion. Yeah.
And I think that's an important way to look at it. And then you can actually send it some love. And that's, I think, the way that you release it, because putting it in judgment and exile, like when we're talking about putting those machines in timeout, when we put these algorithms and these processes that we have and we put them in timeout and we judge them and we say that they're bad and we have shame around them and we don't look at them, they're probably going to persist a lot longer than saying like, okay, thank you for, thank you, alcohol, for getting me through these really hard fucking years.
Yeah.
And I appreciate you very much, and I don't really want you anymore.
Well, so let's talk about the thing about this, the putting of love into it, because this to me is the sort of the central thesis of this book, is that when you pay attention to those things you cannot pay attention to, when you pay attention to those things you can't stop paying attention to. That little thing that tickles in the back of your mind, whether it's, how a sword is made, or, what shoes you want to wear, or, to be honest, architecture, or singing or writing songs. There's so many reasons people invent to not dive into those things. I don't have time to learn a new language or the guitar. I don't have the right workbench for blacksmithing. But that when you go past those reasons and you actually explore that thing, as weird as it is, and I submit that all of our hobbies are weird, every last one of all of our hobbies are weird, they reveal stuff about ourselves to ourselves. We embark on a journey of self-discovery when we do those things. And in my experience, my primary hobbies, which are making costumes from movies I like and putting them on, and props from movies and historical things that I like, and making them until they feel real and like they tell a real story to me, those hobbies are not making the world a better place. I am not actively contributing to the betterment of humanity at the workbench when I'm making a space helmet.
Yeah.
But in the exploration, I am contributing. I'm being part of my culture, but I'm also facing myself, like we all do when we're trying to do something with a high degree of excellence. And that is making me a better citizen, a better man, a better husband, father, partner, friend, community member.
Yeah. It's just like that. The process itself is what shapes the individual, and what shapes the individual then shapes the collective, so it's a really important thing to remember, that it doesn't really necessarily matter what it is exactly you're doing, as long as it's not harming anybody else.
Yeah.
But as long as that's being additive to your life and a helpful part of your process, then you're going to then contribute to the world in a helpful way. You're going to be a happier person, a better father, a better husband, a better contributor to society, because you're going to have that things that you've learned about yourself.
Well, and it's important to me in terms of the other thing that I do with those hobbies is I tell stories about them. As storytelling is I think the thing I've done for a living centrally more than any other single thing, and it's encompassed all the things I've done for a job. And when I tell those stories, it's really important to me. And I say at the opening of the book, my life was not a linear path. Yes, I was 10 when Star Wars came out and I wanted to work on Star Wars, and I was 31 when I got to work on Star Wars. So that looks linear, but all the decisions in between were triage. they were all based on all sorts of things, from my bank account to a divorce to whatever was going on. They happen to end up in a place that seems linear, but I think that in our fame-obsessed culture, it's damaging to think of it as linear, because I encounter and have encountered and still continue to encounter all the same obstacles, the same dark thoughts from my inner critic, the same imposter complex that I always did. There's no amount of notoriety or success that has insulated me in any way from any of the internal mental processes that I was experiencing in the workbench at 20.
Yeah. Yeah, it's that's the great fiction, right? Like, I mean, somebody can look at a person like yourself or like myself and be like, easy for you to say, bro, you know, like, you got it made. You know, look at you. You got so many thousand followers, and you know your bank account looks like this. Like, what could be hard for you in your life? Like, I don't know, everything still. Everything. It's not like these external things solve the internal things.
Right.
You know, they in some ways add pressure, some ways alleviate pressure. It's always a dance, but it really comes back to the individual. How much are you going into your own shadows, going into your own dark corners, and trying to shed a little bit of light and illuminate yourself?
Yeah. There was when Sean Penn made his film about Huey Long. I can't remember what it was called, but he brought an actor out of retirement. I think the actor's name is Jackie Earle Haley. He was in Bad News Bears, and then he was in Breaking Away. And when he found, and they had been young actors together, and so Sean Penn was like, "I want this guy," and they had to find him, and he was like driving limos somewhere in Nevada or something like that. And then all the news stories were like, Sean Penn plucks this actor. And everyone's like, oh my God, look, he was driving limos and he used to be famous. And I was like, he's a person. He lived a life. There's nothing to take away from this, except people live lives that go on these winding paths. And one that starts with the Bad News Bears might end up with you driving limos. And it's not this, like, the ethos of the article is always like, well, he was unhappy and now he's back to happy again.
Yeah, like that was success.
Right. And it's like, this is the wrong message.
Yeah, I mean, the externalization of what happiness it is a big problem. I think it's a primary fiction in our storytelling. Yeah. Like, if you look at storytelling as like the way that we understand the world, we tell the story that I'll be happy when, I'll be happy when, I'll be happy when. Well, when may never come, you know?
John Kabat-Zinn, the man who really brought mindfulness to the West with the mindfulness-based stress reduction clinic in Boston. He says, do you want to know how your life is going to turn out? Everyone's always asking me, I'm wondering how my life is going to turn out. He's like, how is it right now? That's how it is. That's what happened. Yeah. And that's, I found that, I mean, I get chills just saying that again, because I found that so crazy grounding, because it's true. We are always casting a what's it going to be like? What is going to happen? And it's happening right now.
It's happening right now. You know, I'm putting out a newsletter. This will be by the time this podcast comes out, this newsletter will have long been out, but I wrote mine this week. And I've had, you know, pretty consistent bouts of mild depression and anxiety pretty much my whole life. And this last week has been one of the happiest weeks of my life. And it's not due to any particular thing other than just me recognizing that, you know what, everything is good now and has actually always been good no matter what. Even when I was in the job that I hated on a petty salary and was numbing my senses with too much alcohol and doing it, things were good then. Actually, if I would acknowledge that things were good at the start of the company, things were good now, things were good, things will be good then. It's an acceptance. Yeah, yeah. It's all a perception of the abundance that we have readily available, or the perception of some kind of scarcity or need to improve the situation to reach the happiness. But it's all like in our head. It's all the story.
And there are times when I'm driving around. I've certainly had plenty of days in beautiful San Francisco. Like, I've just left my shop, feeling really good, driving my Land Cruiser, which I love, and like, oh, hey, you know, shout out to the coffee person as I'm driving by, and I feel like I'm part of my neighborhood and part of my culture, and it feels great. And this isn't to say I'm bringing myself down, but I remind myself this is as temporary as feeling like shit.
Yeah.
Like, both of these things will happen. There's also this other aspect which I find fascinating culturally, which is we crave the ability to be like, well, I'd just like to know that I could be comfortable. I would just like to know. I am a victim of this as well. I I just would love to know that I could retire and everything would be easy. And my question is, do you really? Because when you go to a movie that's, quote, easy, where you can see what's happening, it's so boring. Right? Movie where you can see every beat happen. Yep. There are exceptions. I would submit as a side note that Strictly Ballroom, Baz Luhrmann's first film, is a movie in which every single narrative beat is telegraphed from about 60 miles away. And for some reason, that film still pumps me full of love every time I see it. However, in general, one of our complaints about movies when we go see them is, I saw the ending coming. I figured out the plot. I understood exactly why he was the bad guy. So we want the variety of not knowing in the stuff we take in the narratives we take in the books and the TV shows and the movies. We like to be surprised. In fact, it's something we seek as an experience, whether it's playing paintball or, going in a bicycle race. So there's part of us that craves the comfort of a lack of surprise, and yet we don't crave that. That would feel like death.
Yeah.
So again, one of the things I say in this book is, when we start to make something, whether it's a company or a podcast or a book or a costume, we have a plan. We have a direction, a trajectory. But what we picture that's at the end of that trajectory is a placeholder, and we never end it there. We never achieve precisely what we thought we were going to make. The costume is always different. The book is always different. And that's the point. That's why we do it, because the path is winding and we don't know where it's going to end. Our job is just to keep putting one foot in front of the other and try to be excellent and mindful about it. And what happens along the way, those aren't failures. We talk about them as failures, and we talk about teaching kids how to fail fast, et.cetera. They're just iterations.
Yeah.
They're branches we went up, and then we realize, that's not the right branch. So we come back down to the trunk and we move up to the next branch. And that one actually is a little better. Okay, so I learned something from this, so I don't have to go all the way back down. Now I can jump. And somebody pointed out to me, I was talking about this at Maker Faire, San Mateo's Maker Faire, the mothership Maker Faire, just on Sunday, which was a couple days ago. And somebody came up to me and they said, my daughter and I came up with a little bit of rhetoric for the end of that, which is the only failure is to go back down to the base and not start again. The only failure is not to keep on going.
So true.
And it's totally true.
It's one of the things that I've talked about before is that people have this kind of goal setting mentality. Well, a goal is a fixed place. It's a placeholder that is very clearly defined. And it's almost like a binary pass fail kind of thing. And it sets you up for largely too much rigidity.
Yeah.
And it sets you up most likely for failure on that, because you're hypothesizing, you're positing something in the future, projecting something in the future that is at a concrete fixed place when you really don't know which way the path will go. Yeah. So instead of setting a goal, I always recommend set an intention. I intend to go towards this thing, but it's not the goal. I'm going to put everything I can, all of my effort, all of my will, all of my ideation, all my creativity, all my passion towards this intention. But the goal is not 100,000 this or 1,000,000 this.
Yeah.
The goal is just the process of trying my very best and then seeing what this wants to become.
And because I would submit to anybody who's achieved any success at anything they've gone after is that the shape of that success blew their minds.
Yeah,
right?
It's never what you think.
It's never what you think. I don't know if you meditate. But
I do.
I'm a meditator for many years. I'm a terrible meditator. I'm not consistent about it.
I don't know who's good at it.
No, that's exactly my point. My point is that I think meditation, I've come to the conclusion after years of doing it poorly and having the worst monkey mind ever, that it is an exercise in forgiveness for what you consider to be failure. And I love reading people like Pema Chodron talk about their anger so honestly about the ways in which they feel like they're falling short, even though they're meditating. And that ability to say, yeah, this is happening. And I don't have to strive for something different than this is happening, except just to be aware that it's happening.
Yeah, awareness is the only real achievable goal when you really look at it. When you really boil it down, like what is possible, and still it can be sometimes obscured by your unconscious or subconscious products, your biases, the lens at which you're looking at things, the obstructions, the protection mechanisms. I get it.
Yeah.
But to have goalness, to have awareness as your intention, I think is one of the most beautiful intentions possible, because then you become aware and disidentified from these thoughts or this anger or this protection mechanism or all these things, the jealousies, whatever it is that it is. When you become aware of them, then you can like look at them and have some equanimity and some peace with what's actually happening. And that is something that meditation teaches you, because the brain produces thoughts like the heart produces beats.
You know, my favorite thing about meditation too, now at this stage of my life, I'm 52, is that I feel like whenever I'm meditating on a regular basis, it feels like it turns me into a mind reader of both myself and other people. You start watching, you start seeing people's emotions played out on their faces and in their bodies.
Yeah.
John Kabat-Zinn again says this wonderful thing you were talking about. Even when you're depressed, you realize afterwards that things were fine, things were good.
Yeah.
Kabat-Zinn says, "Look, as long as you're breathing, there's more right with you than wrong with you." With that basic equation, we can start to do work, and we can start to rebuild.
Yeah, that's the essential component. All right, let's shift gears here a little bit because you got a lot of fans from MythBusters. Let's talk about some myths that you were surprised about, some interesting things that kind of happened, some like a little bit, behind the scenes of like, wow, I actually thought this one might work. Or like, how did the process go when was some of it like raw discovery where you were like, I really don't know.
Oh, it was a ethical value for Jamie and I to follow our noses. And we hit this perfect storm where it was back in the days when television was making more money, so networks took more chances with shows. We made our first pilots with a crew of like 5 people. And the first season, the crew was maybe like 8 or 9 people tops. It was a very light touch from the network. And then the show became a hit. Mm-hmm. So immediately we had more latitude. And the only thing we did with that latitude was we pushed the schedule open so that we had more time to produce the episodes. And we did that for a couple of reasons. One is, being in production full time is exhausting. It's exhausting on the people who are doing it and on their families. And we wanted to keep more normal hours than 14 hours a day, 6 days a week.
Yep.
But the other reason was that we wanted the ability to follow our noses through the process of discovery, pun intended. Which means that when we came to when we went into an experiment, we didn't know how it was going to turn out. And when it came to a result that we didn't expect, it might mean that the next 3 days of locations that we've booked for experiments are no longer viable because we now have to do something totally different. And we would. Mm-hmm. And that's something that, reality television is so not committed to reality that there are reality shows that have table reads. And I'm not kidding.
Oh, yeah. Most of them, actually.
Right? And so this is a producer writes something down, and then everyone just fills in the blanks, and the camera people just button on and button off, and it's not following a real story. So for us, there was an ethical value in trying to come up with rigorous methodologies for testing stuff. And one of the ways we built that rigor in was by arguing with each other constantly. Jamie and I would really, really push each other, and it was a sport, and it was also a creative technique, and it was a very robust technique for building methodologies that felt real. So while our iterations may have been too small for a scientific conclusion, we always tried to build the methodologies with enough rigor that if we could do 1,000 passes, we would publish a paper on this based on this experiment that we did. Mm-hmm. So that's a long way of saying we never gave a shit what the result was going to be.
Right.
We were always just interested in trying to come to a conclusion that would say the result is this. And when we did, there were so many times it was so thrilling. So I'll give an example. Anybody who's studied golf ball mechanics knows that golf balls have dimples because the dimples create tiny little pockets of air which allow the golf ball to slipstream through the air. So a dimpled golf ball will fly far farther than a smooth golf ball. And if you want to try it, you can order smooth golf balls and you can see how crappy they make your swing. They make you look terrible at golf.
But will it straighten out my slice? That's the question.
You put dimples on half the golf ball. So the myth was that if you dimpled a car in the same way that you dimple a golf ball, you'd get the same slipstream and you'd increase your fuel efficiency.
So hail-damaged cars go faster.
And there are wraps that people had developed that had little tiny dimples in them, and they claimed to increase the fuel efficiency. we decided to go whole hog, and we got the automotive design department at the Academy of Art College in San Francisco to send out a bunch of young students. We covered a car in about an inch of clay, and then we carved over 1,000 semi-hemispherical detents out of the clay. So this car was riddled with this stuff. And we ran a fuel efficiency test of that car without that, however, with the same amount of weight in it, so that it weighed the same. And then we ran a fuel efficiency test of the car covered with clay with the dimples. And it's, by the way, we did a bunch of fuel efficiency myths, and these are some of the hardest things to actually test. It is really, really difficult to put a meter in a fuel line to tell you precisely to the gram how much fuel has passed point X.
Right.
So we'd come up with all sorts of other ways. We'd use exactly a 1-gallon tank. And we'd see how far we got. Or we'd use exactly a 1-gallon tank, and we'd weigh it after run 1 and run 2 and run 3. And in each one, we'd get to see, we used X amount of grams of gasoline. But it was always a shit fight. Like, it was never simple to figure out to a high degree of precision how much fuel we'd used for X. But in this one, we did this. We had we rerouted the car's fuel pump to a single fuel cell in the trunk, which we could pull out and weigh. And when we ran the golf ball car, we found a 14% improvement in the fuel efficiency of the car.
Oh, no.
And it was like, both Jamie and I, we had buttoned everything down. We knew that this was a result, and we were like, this is incredible. Both of us were shocked. Just to be clear,
I would have bet the don't side of that hard.
Right.
I would have bet the don't side of that hard.
Most fuel efficiency improvements are improvements of like 2%, 3%. And you know, probably your mood can affect your fuel efficiency by 10% or more.
Sure.
It's the single biggest factor of whether you're heavy on the brakes or not. And there are hypermilers in Japan who get, 80 miles an hour out of a normal Civic because they're driving with bare feet, and they're probably a nightmare to drive behind. Okay, but that being said, when we came to that result, we didn't allow our camera crew. We didn't allow. Our camera crew agreed with us. Our producer Alice and our crew agreed not to shoot any more than that one take of our response, because it was never going to get more amazing than our absolute shock at this fuel efficiency, the high five of holy cow, this totally worked. And the best coda on that is a few months later, we got an email from one of the big 3 automakers, and they pulled, so they're often their main model of a car, their first pass at the full physical shape of a car is carved in clay.
Yeah.
And so they pulled one of their old clay cars out of storage. They carved a whole bunch of detents in it that matched ours, and they ran wind tunnel tests in it. And they wrote us to show us that their wind tunnel tests did not come to the same conclusion. Now, that's fine with me. One, they used an SUV where we were using a sedan. So I don't think that these results are applicable. But secondly, I was delighted that we had wasted the time of a giant multinational billion-dollar corporation to test this thing that we'd come up with on our scrappy little show.
That's wild. That's really wild. And to think that they were invested in it. I wonder if they were investigating out of their own curiosity, or whether they were investigating because they're like, man, we really don't want to put dimples in our fucking cars.
I have an opinion. I think that because I've gotten to meet, obviously, people who have jobs that traipse into many different areas of engineering love Mythbusters. The polymaths, the people who are interested in both car manufacturing and sword making, starting fires, wilderness survival, like anyone who loves all that stuff is just part of our core fan base. And I've met enough that work for giant corporations to know that really big, smart companies have a few people on deck whose only job is to just think as blue sky as they can. And these folks run teams of amazing engineers just trying everything. And auto manufacturers are famous for their prototyping and their one-offs of like, okay, what if?
Yeah.
And so I think that was just part of the budget of a what if group.
That's
which
cool.
I love.
Yeah.
And frankly, if I could have any job in the world, it would be probably for one of those companies doing exactly that kind of work.
Yeah, that sounds phenomenal. An interesting part of your story too is, we started this podcast talking about storytelling. I mean, a myth in and of itself is a story that has been told and passed and passed and passed, and it becomes something that is implanted in us.
And why does it propagate? It propagates because we find the premise interesting. It's super intuitive or it's super counterintuitive. but it is a story for helping us understand how the world works.
Yeah.
So when we say things like, oh, a penny dropped from the Empire State Building will kill you when it hits the ground, you're like, oh, really? Wow. Okay, that story intersects with me because I could throw a penny off the Empire State Building. Would I be killing someone? Apparently no one cares, because if you go to any level below the observation deck on the Empire State Building, they're littered with change. So apparently no one really believes this story, or New York tourists are a bunch of murderous bastards. Both could be true. But again, I think these stories propagate. It's funny that you come back to myths and urban legends, because it is where the show started. But we ran out of classic urban legends probably by episode 20.
Yeah.
Then we get to movie physics, popular misconceptions, idiomatic phrases, which are all part and parcel of the same thing. They're stories we tell each other to try and understand the world. And we remember the things that stick in our brains. We remember the good stories. So here's an example of, to me, a great good science story, which is my freshman earth science teacher, Dan Frere, at Sleepy Hollow High School. This is like 1980, 81. He said, he's telling us about glaciers. And he's like, the best way to understand a glacier is that it's a river on Quaaludes.
Whoa.
Right? And I was like, I have never not been able to understand what I see in glaciers since then. Not to say I'm some genius about glaciers, but everything I've ever learned about glaciers since then has made sense using that framework. Right. And he took these facts and he put them in a story that was funny and stuck in my head, and yet contained a deep truth about the physics of glaciers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so interesting, and it seems like a lot of these legends hijack. Some of them hijack fear, like the penny off the, or even on another show,
or razor blades and apples at Halloween,
right? Or like it's needles in the seats of movie theaters or something like that. Yep. And then other things, even like I watched Jeremy Wade from River Monsters, which is another show I really liked. Yeah. I watched him do a piece on piranhas, where you think that if there's piranhas and there's any blood in the water or anything like that they will just devour you. Yeah. Well, he got in, and then he or sharks, and he's did a couple things where he's like, not really. Not
there
really.
Are I'm gonna get species of aquatic beings that could strip
that
human
could
really
do
quickly,
that,
but it's not piranhas.
But it's not. Yeah, but it's not like exactly what we think. We're like piranhas. I'm dead. I'm dead for sure. No, don't go swimming in Brazil ever, anywhere at all. But then there are certain things that are actually out there. So just kind of differentiating that. But fear is that distorting lens. Yeah. And then stories that are kind of hijacking that. I think that's something that the news does in its own ways, its own form of sorcery and black magic, is they'll hijack these currents of fear or these currents of greed or these currents. A lot of people do these in different ways.
That's really fascinating you say that. You're right. I mean, that's the thing that's killing me about the news these days is the both sideserism. But of course, what that's based on is their need to show you a thing and then its opposite to create attention. That is the only kind of story a lot of journalists seem to know how to tell. Yeah,
and it's this story that everybody wants to feel like we want to have this. It's like the dark side of tribalism, my tribe versus your tribe. It makes you feel more bonded with your own tribe when you have a common enemy. It's like every alien movie ever. Think Independence Day. The aliens come. Guess what? Nobody cares what country you're from because we're all fighting the aliens. Yeah. You know what I mean? It's like this unifying force. We're defined as a tribe by our opposition to a certain degree. And that's a framework that I think as a world we got to transcend.
We really have to transcend if we are going to make it out of this. And when I say this, I mean our desperate situation, both politically and environmentally. It's only going to be by connecting with each other. I am very vocal about my politics on Twitter, and I lean heavily left. And I try very hard when I'm talking to someone who I disagree with, but who I feel is talking to me in good faith, and that phrase is everything. If I feel like they're talking to me in good faith, I take it as axiomatic that we both have the same goal, which is to create a better world for our kids and our family and our friends and our community. And if that's our same goal, then we can differ on methods about whether you think so-and-so should take care of this and so-and-so should take care of that. Those are methodological differences. But when I'm dealing with people, to me, there's this whole debate about good faith, bad faith these days. And what I realized is, oh my gosh, all of society runs on good faith. In fact, all of our laws, all of our agreements, they're all just loose agreements that we've all made together in this collective hallucination to try and get along. And that's what makes us so vulnerable to bad faith actors, I feel.
Yeah.
And it's the only way you can surmount those bad faith actors that seek to divide us is to continually realize, and being a person who travels around a lot, I have a very public platform. I meet a lot of people. The more people I meet, the more I see how we are all the same. We are all trying to do the same thing. There is nothing that divides us, whether we're from America or Belgium or some tiny island in the Pacific. And the only way, again, I go back to this axiom, which has been feeling very healing to me lately, which is the only way we're going to make it through this period, if we do, is because we've learned how to really connect with each other and understand and appreciate each other's experience.
Yep. And it's going to take some repatterning of the storytelling and framework that we have, which defines ourselves based on our opposition rather than defines ourselves based on our commonality.
There's a book, Neil Stephenson is one of my favorite science fiction writers. He's also a good friend. And he wrote a book called Seven Eves a few years ago, which is wonderful. The opening of the book, this is not a spoiler because it's the opening line of the book. The moon blows up and the moon begins to break apart into 7 large chunks. Or it breaks apart into 7 large chunks, which then start to bang into each other, which makes smaller chunks, of course. And as those chunks get smaller and smaller, the Earth's gravitational pull starts pulling it down to the potential destruction of humanity. So that's
a great premise.
Oh, yeah. It's totally amazing and super intense. It's one of the best books I've read.
Don't blow up the moon, anybody, please.
Right. Well, it's never explained why or how the moon blows up. Like, that's just taken as the axiomatic beginning.
I just see the Armageddon drilling into the moon and putting a bomb in the core of it and blowing it into pieces.
Talk about the wrong stuff. Anyway, the book spans 5,000 years. So, spoiler, humanity makes it through this period. And when they do, humanity has all of the ability to look back through all of human history, right? We can see the pyramids, we can see the Age of Enlightenment, we can see democracy, we can see what happened to us at the point at which the moon broke and the Earth was rendered unlivable for a while. And so as humanity rebuilds humanity, they don't make smartphones again because they were like, yeah, that didn't really work out for us the first time. I love that. I think that's Neil editorializing.
Yeah.
I haven't asked him directly, but I believe that. And I agree. I don't know if they're working out for us right now.
Yeah, it's really interesting to look at that and thinking about that. You almost wonder if we're driving the Earth to such a point of crisis that we actually have a clear and present danger that we can all rally behind. Because right now we're at an environmental point where there's climate change deniers, there's climate change agreeers, but everything's still pretty comfortable. You're out in LA, it's still pretty much 75 and sunny. We're here in Texas, it was a drought for a minute, but now it's wet as hell and there's rain all the time, and it's just kind of things are normal enough.
Weird, but
it's normal enough.
Still livable now,
that it's like not people are like, environment.
If you choose to ignore it, you can.
You can.
You have the luxury of ignoring
it. But imagining it getting really bad, that might be the only thing that can really bring everybody together when they're like, oh, wow, birds are falling from the sky.
Well,
we can't breathe.
And the birds are falling from the sky.
More birds falling from the sky.
We have an insect collapse. Do you notice you get less insects on your windshield? We're having a collapse of the entire insect populations. Yeah.
And maybe that's the thing that we need. So that we stop saying China and Russia and we're like, or maybe it is. Maybe we, with one of our great telescopes, we see one of these asteroids that's coming that they posit
well, you're
wiped out the
dinosaurs. Watchmen.
It is.
Right? That's how Ozymandias thinks humanity will heal itself, by rallying around a common cause.
And maybe we are heading. Maybe that was some artistic genius that we need some common cause that hurts enough for us to go okay. Enough is enough. Who cares if you're gay and you want to marry each other? That's not the problem.
No.
There is an asteroid coming, everybody. Let's figure some other more important shit out, please.
Well, and so those two things that you just talked about, I think that we could view those right now culturally as who cares if you're gay and you want to get married or not? There are children starving. Why are we debating whether or not children should be eating school lunches? where they should have just a cheese sandwich because their parents can. Why? How can we possibly be discussing this? There are people of such surpassing wealth that it is impossible to even conceive of how much money they have. And we're still talking about school systems letting kids go hungry. This is appalling. So part of me also thinks about science fiction. Like, I like science fiction where you end up meeting an advanced race where they look at us and they're like, yeah, not many conscious races get past this point. I mean, maybe this is just growing. This is the adolescence of an intelligent society, or it's the end.
Maybe this is the universal natural selection process, and it's
could
just
certainly
like
be.
It's right
And
on
maybe
a 50-50
we're not worthy.
edge, right?
Maybe we're not worthy.
I mean, humans, we're on the do or the don't side. It's yet to be determined. But in the span of infinite time and infinite worlds and infinite races that may develop, I bet there's some that do make it and some that don't make it. And you look at the work of like Graham Hancock and some people who, can have evidence for these highly advanced civilizations 12,000 years ago that have built some of the monoliths around there. And it looks like, they got probably a lot farther than we thought they got.
I love positing that, especially when you go back a few million years and you realize that plate tectonics could easily eliminate any evidence of a prior advanced civilization that existed on Earth. That there's plenty of time potentially for it to have happened and us to have no actual evidence of it. Yeah, that's really neat.
Yeah.
And this goes back to a sort of a history buff that I am. I love some of my wife's jewelry because it looks like you could have bought it at a stand in Rome in 100 AD. Because I can see how it was made, and I know I've been to the museums and I've seen Roman jewelry, and I think that if you could speak the language and you were dropped into Rome right now, the most surprising thing, aside from the horrible stench, would be how familiar it all is.
There.
Oh, I'm sure.
Florence is so much better.
I'm sure the past stinks to high heaven. People dumping their chamber pots in the streets, it must have been horrifying. However, I'll bet you'd be walking around going, oh, there's a restaurant. There's a brothel. There's a gym. There's a storage facility. Like that. There's a library. Like, all of this stuff is really clear to me. I love the idea that going back in time would be like surprisingly familiar rather than some what's going on kind of moment.
I think that that famous line, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." I think that's like always true.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like, it's really kind of always true in some weird way, because I do believe that this is the best of times, and in some ways it's the worst of times. And we always maintain this kind of level at 7,
George Church says this very much as one of his arguments for, look, things are in the shitter and things are really bad and humans suffer all over the world. However, if you could be a sentient being about to be born as a baby on Earth, if you were about to be born and you could spin a lottery wheel to choose any year to be born, what year would you choose? It's always this year.
Yep.
It's always the current year. This is when you look at the swath of human suffering over the ages. And Hans Rosling was this amazing data statistician, science communicator who built a video that changed the way I made MythBusters. It's a video you can go find online. Hans Rosling, health and wellness over the past 200 years is the subject of his talk, and he shows how health and wellness of humanity has just been on a linear climb for the last, and he's just looking at the data we have that's consistent, so it's 200 years. You get to watch it dip during World War I and the influenza epidemic. That drops the population of the world down, and so does World War II. But it's on an upward trajectory. And so, by and large, we are making things better at the same time as we're killing this spaceship we're on.
But the interesting thing, the mindfuck of all this, though, is that as the external is clearly better, undeniably better, and the best it's ever been, it's almost humans need, and Mark Manson talks about this in his latest book, Everything is Fucked, human beings need a certain level of struggle to have a certain sense of meaning, which makes the mind work. So in the absence of these external struggles, like Sebastian Junger talks about in his book Tribe, like when the bombs were falling on London, a lot of the Londoners were the happiest. They recall that as surprisingly one of the happiest times ever, because all of their problems were externalized. It was the Nazis. They didn't have to worry about their own anxiety or depression. And it was horrifying. Their friends were dying in bombs, but somehow the external forces were a little bit actually preferable to the internal strife we'll create in abundance.
Well, this is all over Peter Jackson's film, They Shall Not Grow Old. Peter, when he started digitizing the footage, he realized, I want to hear some interviews with these soldiers. And then he realized that we're in this cultural moment where, for the last couple decades, where World War I was a bloodbath. It was a horrifying meat grinder of a bloodbath, and everybody died. And Peter, being from New Zealand and Australia are defined as countries by what they went through in World War I.
Kia kaha.
But back then, sorry. I get ahead of myself. So he asked the BBC for older interviews from the 60s, when a lot of these guys were alive and younger, and this wasn't the cultural moment that it was a meat grinder. And many of them say unequivocally, "Oh, it was the best time of my whole life. Yeah. We were running over a parapet, and machine guns were mowing down my buddies, and it was awful. I've never felt more alive, ever before or since." We are a weird species, and
We are a weird
part of
species.
part of the Fermi paradox. My response to the Fermi paradox: if there is intelligent life that is on an infinite number of planets, how come we haven't seen it yet? Mine is: have you watched our television shows? I'm not sure I'd want to contact. I'm not sure if I was an intelligent race that I'd be ringing the doorbell of this planet
Because
anytime
Will Smith
soon.
is going to try to ram his spaceship up your ass if you're a sentient species coming to the Earth. We've made that really clear.
Exactly.
In every movie we had. Well, man, it was a pleasure to sit down and talk with you and interact with a brilliant mind such as yourself. I'm just happy that you're here on this planet at this time and able to think about the problems that we have on the micro and the macro.
Well, this podcast followed the axiom of what was one of the original titles of this book, which one of the original titles I was thinking about is the punchline to Kurt Vonnegut's favorite dirty joke, which is, and he doesn't even remember the joke anymore, but the punchline is, "Keep your hat on, we could end up miles from here." And that's definitely what happened in the book, and that's exactly what happened in this last hour. So I really appreciate
Beautiful.
a lovely
And the book
rambling conversation.
Thank you, brother. I appreciate that. The book is Every Tool's a Hammer by yourself, Adam Savage. I'm sure this is Amazon, Audible,
It is. I just passed
all
it in
things.
the airport for the first time. I got to see my
Amazing.
book on the airport shelf. That was so exciting.
Amazing. Well, I can't wait to dive in myself as well.
What a
And
pleasure.
It was a real pleasure.
Thanks, Aubrey.
And thank you, everybody.